Mahima, go ahead.
Namaste and good afternoon, or rather good morning to Professor Koen De Feyter. I'm Mahima Kapoor, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav Evam Niti Anusandhan Sansthan. Extend my heartiest welcome to the #Web Policy Talk on shifting conceptions of development in international law under the State of Development Discourse series. This discussion is being organized by the Center of Human Dignity and Development, IMPRI, and Center for Development, Communication and Studies, Jaipur. I'm honored to welcome our distinguished panelists for the session. The chair and moderator, Professor Sunil Ray, has served as the director of Sinha Institute of Social Studies, Patna. Prior to that, he was Dean, School of Social Sciences and head, Center for Economic Studies and Policy at the Central University of South Bihar. He was professor of economics at the Institute of Development Studies, Jaipur, and has taught at the National Institute of Rural Development, Hyderabad. Further, he was a visiting fellow at the Institute of Development Studies, Sussex, and Institute of Oriental Studies, Russia. He was awarded Senior Fellowship by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research and Indo-German Research Cooperation at Max Weber Stiftung to work on alternative development paradigm. Professor Ray was a part of the review mission team of the European Commission and has worked on several consulting assignments with the World Bank and other international organizations. His papers have been published extensively in reputed national and international journals such as Economic and Political Weekly, International Journal of Ecological Economics, Asian Survey, Savings and Development, Capitalism, Nature and Socialism, among others. He has authored several books including Industrial Growth and Protection in India, Natural Resources, Organization and Technology Linkages, Agricultural Services and the Poor, Management of Natural Resources, Institutions for Sustainable Livelihood, and Theorizing Cohesive Development and Alternative Paradigm. Presently, Professor Ray is also advisor at IMPRI and CDECS, Jaipur. Welcome, sir. Our esteemed speaker for this policy talk is Professor Koen De Feyter. He is a professor of Public International Law and the spokesperson of the Law and Development Research Group at the Law Faculty of University of Antwerp, Belgium. He is a member of the steering committee of the Global Law and Development Research Network. He currently serves on the United Nations Human Rights Council expert mechanism on the right to development. He has published and taught widely on development and human rights issues from a legal and interdisciplinary perspective. His published books include Human Rights, Social Justice in the Age of the Market, Privatization and Human Rights in the Age of Globalization, Out of the Ashes, Reparation for Victims of Gross Violations of Human Rights, Encyclopedia of Law and Development, among many others. Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Now, I would like to invite Professor Ray to give his opening remarks and invite our speaker further. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mahima. Thank you for very nice introduction. I really feel privileged to moderate the presentation of the discussion going to be initiated by Professor Koen. He's a very scholarly person, as he appears. Definitely something which is very important for us to feel happy that he is speaking in this forum. Professor Koen, although you know, Dr. Arjun wrote to you as to what this forum is all about, but very briefly to inform you that Dr. Arjun, in his innovative way, and with his greatest inquisitiveness to search for new domain of knowledge, he opened, as the director of this institute, he opened this forum. And this forum is basically meant not to repeat, not to reproduce the knowledge base, which are already existing. It is something in a forum is meant to reflect upon new ideas, new thought process, new conception, something which would be helping us, the intellectual community, to demystify the very conception that has been existing for several decades and centuries of development. It is necessary. And from that point of view, he has been organizing this forum, discussion, presentation. This is part of the 6th in the series. And I could come across a very interesting topic that Professor Koen has chosen to share with us, to discuss about and all that. I really feel privileged to be a part of this. I feel privileged to be part of this for 2 reasons. One, that I am in a discussion to be initiated by such a scholarly person. And second, the kind of issue that he's going to raise is something which is going to open up. And for me, it's all the more. It's very interesting, very challenging. Perhaps I never thought much about it at an earlier stage. So it is intellectually quite going to be stimulating. Rather, he is trying to open up a great understanding of something which has not been unraveled. He is opening up to the intellectuals of this part of the world to see that there is another gray area which could be addressed in a very systematic manner. Now, why I'm saying all this thing, not that of course I do not know what he's going to speak about, but I've read the few points in his outline which he sent, and I could see this one. Essentially, the question is that, what could be the role of international law to frame the international relations or cooperation for development? That's the fundamental question that he's talking about. But much more fundamental is that shifting, it is necessary for us to conceive development not in the same traditional manner. There are varieties of areas. It's not traditional manner when I mean to say, this kind of thing, development, GDP growth, this and that people keep talking about. He stops at, he said that there are other areas that you need to address very systematically. What is those? Social injustice, social discrimination, patriarchy, racism, all this, and of course the human right, all this together. He questions the fundamentals of the conception of the human rights. Now, may I ask a question? This is a very important area that he's talking about, and how really it will have the legality. That means, how do you want to institutionalize this one in terms of its legalization of this process? Like, for example, in India, we had 100 years of job. Narega, for example, every individual got that's being legalized. Now one can go to the court and ask the question why it's not being given. That's one thing. Whether people are going or not, that's a different issue. But then this is the legal framework that's. But the question is that, very simple thing. Each and every individual, as you said, equal access. Each and every individual has every right to live with dignity. Men, women, which caste one belongs to, which social groups one belongs to, which race one belongs to, which economic class one belongs to, it certainly shouldn't matter. Each and every species, individual species, has the right to survive, has the right to live with dignity, keeping the head high. And sustainability development, it is sustainable development. That's precisely what it is. And my question is that, if this is understood, and not understood, it's understood everywhere. There's nothing new I'm talking about. It's being talked about every day and night by the policymakers, by the governors who govern the state, country, all over the world. But look at the practice. It never happens. Look at India, for example. Now, how many people, hundreds of people are simply suffering in the court, for example, in prison without trial? It is before us in India. Maybe the story could be same in some other countries as well. But the question is the simple question. What is the law here? Open the constitution, perhaps it says that everybody has the right. But when it comes to practice, you find this colossal, what's called, is a betrayal of the constitutional rights of every individual. Now, without trial for years, if somebody suffers in the prison, what does it justify? What kind of dignity that you talk about? What kind of human right that you talk about? In other words, my always question is that if I see the people are not surviving, crying for oxygen is something, that is something I'm dying on the street day and day night. What kind of human right that you're talking about? In other words, Professor Koen might be certainly being moved by all these scenarios all over the world. Look at Myanmar. Look at many other southern or African countries. Look at Mexico and some of the Latin American countries. The kind of suffering, the toiling they are having is something which is inhuman, is totally below the human dignity. Now, question is that, what does the human rights something? Where it comes? Now, Professor Koen is going to address, as I presume, is these issues and how need to be legalized, possibly the international law, how need to be framed to say that these human sufferings, not only the human sufferings in terms of its own institutional kind of a repression, but also, for example, ecology. That is another aspect which he has touched upon. Those talking about UN sustainable goal is one thing which has been there always. It has been shifting also. Look at 2015, then it goes to 2030, maybe then again 2050, but situation is going to remain same. My question could be at the end, perhaps there could be many questions to Professor Koen, only to enlighten myself or some other people. But the question is that, it's a very interesting topic that he's going to talk about, to enlighten us to see that what legal law that can be framed. That is what is in, and maybe that he's talking about solidarity among the people. And this, I have done personally take the reference of this one. It's a solidarity between the human and human and nature. That's something which is going to survive, help us to survive. We have to survive, we have to co-evolve with the nature. You cannot tell it simply at the cost of nature, or human beings at the cost of some other inequality, for example, will certainly ensure sustainability. Having said all this, I'm sorry that I'm taking time. Having said all that, these are the issues which are very pertinent, which are very burning, and something which is very stimulating, intellectually speaking, that to learn from somebody, a scholarly person like Professor Koen. May I request Professor Koen to enlighten us, deliver his presentation, even if it takes a little more time than is being scheduled, doesn't matter. It's a very interesting topic that I'm looking forward to hear you from Professor Koen. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you, Professor Dr. Arjun and Mohima, of course, who is initiating, and that's really very good. I request Professor Koen to really initiate the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and also for inviting me to give this short address on how international law has worked with the concept of development over the years, and what the future might hold in terms of the role of law and international law in particular with regard to this topic. It's a pleasure also to be, if not physically, at least back in India. I've had the pleasure of working from time to time in India, particularly with National Law University in New Delhi, and to pick up on one of the issues you raised, the One of the projects was on how slum dwellers in India tried to use the right to water and sanitation to improve their access to drinking water and sanitation facilities in the slums. And this was socio-legal research. And also it was a question about, the issue was about, okay, you have a recognition also in Indian courts, all the way up to the Supreme Court, of the right to water and sanitation, but is it effective? Does invoking that right, which is in the law, actually help you in improving living conditions? And maybe I can return to the findings in our discussion. But it's to say one thing already. It's clear that simply having the law on the books doesn't suffice, right? That there are a number of factors that determine whether protection that is legally provided also works in practice. And it really requires also, if we talk human rights, it really requires a lot of strategic insight to be able to use them in a way that they actually deliver on the promise that they hold. And there are, so for instance, networking relations are very important. Also an understanding of the circumstances in which they may work and in which they may not work. And so the results of the research were certainly mixed. There were some positive examples of courts actually coming to the rescue of people, in cases of when slums were bound to be demolished, for instance, and then sometimes legal provisions worked. On the right to water and sanitation as such, very often slum dwellers decided not to use the law, but rather to say, well, we know that in an election period we can get things done because politicians will come and visit the slums. And so we'll mobilize around that rather than going through a legal avenue. Because if you go legal, then we are going confrontational. And unless we have sufficient support, non-legal support, that may actually have a counterproductive result. But again, maybe we can talk a bit more about these very, very practical issues towards the end, because my topic is in fact a bit more abstract and a bit more the broad canvas than sort of the reality of how this works. Yes, maybe we can move to the next slide, Arjun. The law and international law, and in particular, has engaged with the issue of development for a very long time, and there is almost a school of thought or an approach called law and development, which emerged mainly in the post-independence period, when many people or many researchers in the former colonial powers started to think about what will be our role vis-a-vis the newly independent countries. Very recently, two colleagues from the University of Warwick in the UK, which is one of the leading institutions, obviously, on law and development, at least in Europe, published this edited volume where they look back at 40 years of working on law and development. And actually, Abdul Paliwala suggests in the introduction that maybe we should abandon the concept of development altogether, because it's a discredited idea. The finding that the word development has been used very often to actually create injustices. And I think particularly of economic development and liberal economic development, so that there's an association in many parts of the world, and certainly among vulnerable or marginalized communities, that development has become a bad word and something that threatens them, because it's used by political elites, for instance, to argue that a certain vision of development, which is actually detrimental to poor people. And so as they, and it's not that the entire book makes that argument, but they say that it's one of the key issues that they want to discuss, is whether we should not abandon the word and replace it by other words and be more direct, and instead of using this amorphous word, talk about issues like patriarchy, impoverishment, human rights violation, exploitation, and so on, and no longer use that word that seems to cover all sorts of different meanings, and many of which are not so positive. Next slide, please. Particularly on the role of international law, there is again a group of scholars who call themselves TWAIL, and it's more like a discussion group. It's not very structured. And TWAIL stands for Third World Approaches to International Law, where it's pointed out that international law in the pre-colonial period was an instrument to justify colonialism, right? That if you look at the history of international law, the international law was used to explain how the colonial powers could establish sovereignty over the territories that were discovered. The international law was also a system that was open to an international society, but that international society was pretty exclusive, because the members of the international society had to fulfill certain conditions, and those conditions were that you had to be a state that resembled the states as we knew them in the West, so that there was no need, for instance, to treat other systems of government that the colonial powers encountered in the global South on the same footing as the states in Europe among themselves, right? That you could simply, well, you would conclude agreements with them, but those agreements would be mostly to determine which of the European powers could exercise sovereignty over which colonies, rather than to create rights with the local leadership. So the history of international law in the colonial period is in many ways at the service of colonialism, right? Which also explains why there is a lingering distrust in many parts of the global South with regard to international law, because international law is seen as hegemonic, as representing hegemonic interests, as still taking into account that history in the pre-colonial period. But then TWAIL scholars will argue that actually not so much has changed in the post-colonial period. That still today, it's the major industrialized powers of the world that shape and determine the form of international law, and that therefore international law is also very often an instrument to maintain inequalities that exist within the world. And so the international lawyers within the trail movement challenge that traditional role of international law and want to investigate to what extent that system of law can also be used for what they call progressive politics. They also challenge the distinction between the global south and the global north more and more, in terms of arguing that also in the global north, there are pockets of the global south, and that really the concern should be with marginalized communities all over the world, whether they're slum dwellers in Delhi or whether they're slum dwellers in New York. And so that our concept of global south and global north should no longer be a purely geographical concept and no longer the traditional distinction, but it's really what they are about is how international law can address inequality among countries, but also within countries, and within countries could be any country in the world. Next slide, please. In this Encyclopedia of Law and Development, which I had the pleasure of co-editing and which has just been published a few months ago, we feel that there is a potential positive role that law and international law can play with regard to development. In that book, we've also discussed this idea of whether development should be abandoned as a concept, and we feel it shouldn't. But also we recognize that it takes a really conscious effort to turn law into an emancipatory concept for development, and then development understood as addressing inequality and social justice. So that it's certainly not self-evident to do that, and it takes, and it may not even be the mainstream way of looking at the relationship, so that it's to some extent an uphill battle to achieve that end. One element in that is to ensure that the debate on law and development is also an inclusive debate, right? That it's owned very much also with by scholars from what we traditionally call the global south, and so in the encyclopedia, for instance, we made a conscious effort to ensure that at least half of the authors that are writing in the encyclopedia are from the global south, because there's also inequality in the publishing world. Even on issues of development, all the mainstream publishers, I mean, the Oxford, Cambridge, all of those are in the West, right? And the publishing standards are also very often determined by Western publishers, particularly if you're a non-English speaker. If you're in Latin America, for instance, and you try to publish on law and development and you want to reach an international audience, you have to do it in English, have to find access to these international publishers, and the thresholds are much higher than when you're a European scholar in Europe. So there are also issues of inequalities very much within how we publish research. And so again, this is one of the things that this Law and Development Research Network, of which I'm a part, tries to address. Also to look very critically at ourselves and at our position as researchers, both in the North and in the South, and at how we can make scientific research more plural and more inclusive. Yes, next slide, please. Okay. So here's a very, very brief overview of the history of international law with regard to development post-colonialism. And so maybe the first thing to say is that there hasn't been within international law a very systematic approach or systemic approach to defining development. So you have a multitude of sources, going from international treaties that clearly have a certain view of development, often define development for the purpose of the treaty, to resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly, acts of intergovernmental organizations, very often UN organizations, because they have to take this sort of holistic view, come up with definitions of development that they use for the purpose of their own organization. You've already referred in the introduction to for instance, the World Bank that has indicators to say, well, these are the countries that can lend from the bank, and those indicators then also reflect a concept of development, which in their case is very much focused on economic growth. So clearly, economic growth was the starting point. There's no doubt about that, and also immediately after independence, it is about the newly independent countries governing sovereignty over their territories and an absolute right to exploit the natural resources on the territory, a state right to do that as one of the prizes that has been won by gaining independence, right? Not much concerns about the environment at the beginning at all. Exploitation of natural resources is seen as a source of income, as an economic resource, as an advantage that developing countries may have, and it's all about gaining control also over the multinational companies that often came from the colonial powers, and replacing that by national sovereignty, and in order to uplift the population, but it's very much about state sovereignty for the purposes of gaining sufficient income that ideally is then distributed among the population. Later, you get the shift to basic needs that's very strong within the International Labour Organization, where they come from a more social context and try to integrate that, not challenging economic growth, but then complementing that with a social dimension. In the 1970s, the new international economic order, which is interesting because it's another reason why international law is relevant. The very soon developing countries start arguing that it's not only about what happens domestically, that a lot of the inequality flows from the international economic system, and that therefore a new international economic order is needed. It needs to be enshrined in international law, where all sorts of where you can challenge, for instance, the way the international financial institutions work, later on the way the World Trade Organization perceives of international trade, generally to ensure that in regulating the international economy, the interests of developing countries are taken into account much more. Again, looking at the legacy of international law as dating back to the pre-colonial period, saying, well, now, given the fact that the structure of the international system has changed, and that the majority of the states now are developing countries, we have to change the whole way we regulate the international economic system. Was relatively unsuccessful because the developed countries stopped. Didn't want to, opposed that idea, and the language has changed, but it's still there. Now, in the current, today, you find reference to an enabling international environment. If you look at the 2030 agenda, the SDGs, there are ample references to the need to not just look at how developing countries organize domestically, but also to provide an enabling international environment. And that language now in international documents has really become the successor language in a way to what used to be called the new international economic order, but it's still the same idea that a lot of the responsibility for the inequality within developing countries lies with the international institutions, how they are organized, and particularly then with how developed countries use these international institutions for their own benefit. The United Nations Development Program then came up with the concept of human development, development as freedom, again, also, using Indian scholars very often, as you know, to promote that idea. And so here you get then, in human development, you get not only indicators that talk about income, but also about access to education and so on, and access to health, right? So a more holistic concept of development, very much promoted in the UNDP Human Development Reports, influential. And that then leads also to the human rights-based approach to development, the idea that human rights become themselves a component of development, right? That you cannot have development without human rights, and that you can't have a trade-off between the two. That in fact, if human rights themselves are an element of development, then there cannot be development without respect of human rights. And as we will see, the Declaration on the Right to Development, which is a non-binding resolution by the United Nations General Assembly, makes that very, very clear. And that was, of course, in response to authoritarian governments that were always arguing, we have to have development, economic development first, before we will be able to realize human rights. So human rights becomes, at least within the UN approach, becomes an element of development. And that follows really from the notion of human development. And then the sort of the final phase is this move from human development to sustainable development, where the environmental dimension finally is taken into account much more. And maybe the last stage in that evolution is this notion of planetary boundaries now, where the idea is, well, human development is fine, but we also have to think about what the planet can take. And therefore, maybe our aspirations on what we want for the human has to take into account our effect on the non-human, right? And so maybe we have to rethink a bit this concentration of our efforts only on humans, because if we continue in that vein, we will actually be destroying the planet on which we live. And so even from a human development perspective, that would be counterproductive, but also the idea that nature has a value in itself, even if it's not useful to humans, right? And that there are living things that also need to be protected, even beyond their intrinsic, that they have intrinsic value beyond the value that they have to humans. But we'll maybe return to that at the end. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, I'll do this very briefly, but just to explain that international law also doesn't have a definition of developing countries. So there is we don't know what they are in international law, which means that each time we use the term in a treaty, for instance, we have to say what we mean. And it becomes a part of the negotiations. For instance, in the World Trade Organization, developing countries enjoy a number of preferences. But when you want to enter the WTO, you have to negotiate whether you are a developing country or not, right? So it becomes a part of the debate whether, and so because there are somewhat oddly maybe, but in international law there are advantages to being a developing country, because you can sometimes then have preferential treatment which you lose if you move out of the category. So it becomes a bit of an ambivalent game. We have a definition of least developed countries that is generally accepted. right? And I think all international legal instruments accept the definition of least developed countries that is revised, at least, you know, the categories that the countries that belong to the category is revised every 2 years, every 3 years by a body of the of ECOSOC. On the other hand, it's also clear that if you go back to developing countries, they're becoming increasingly diverse. You know, and if you read, for instance, the Rio +20 outcome document, it really becomes almost impossible to use, because there are so many different developing countries now that all for some reason may need some sort of special and differential treatment, that it becomes really, really very complicated. And so there is a question now whether the term developing countries will actually survive in the future in international law, and whether it won't be a much more differentiated concept that we're using, like you already have in the Paris Agreement, for instance, where it's really nationally determined contributions, where there are still references there to developing countries as a group. But on the other hand, the system of the Paris Agreement is really differentiation country by country now, right? And it reflects also the growing divisions within the group of developing countries, I think, over the world. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so for better or for worse, we're the mainstream definition of sustainable development now in international law. The mainstream definition of development today is sustainable development. And here there's this formula that says that there are 3 dimensions: the economic, the social, and the environmental, that they are integrated and indivisible and should be balanced. Okay. So, and nobody seems to, or very few people seem to disagree with that concept of development. The difficulty is to put it into practice, right? And to operationalize that. What does it mean, and how do you do this balancing? That you know, it reads really nicely, you know, but how can it be done in practice? And also in the legal sense, what does it mean to say that they are the economic, the social, and the environmental are equally important? Next slide, please. Maybe first we have to think about, you know, is this actually a legal concept, sustainable development? You know, and the International Court of Justice already in 1997, this is the first time that the court was confronted with an environmental case. You know, so it's the beginning of the greening, if you like, of the International Court of Justice. This was about the building of a dam complex on the Danube between Hungary and Slovakia in Europe, where after a change of government in Hungary, concerns were raised by the new government about the impact on the water quality of the river, of the building, and they wanted to get out of they had concluded, the two countries had concluded an international treaty to build these dams, and Hungary wanted to get out of the treaty and said, well, you know, we have new environmental insights, and we would prefer not to continue the building of the dam. And so then the court goes into this balancing a bit, in this case between the economic and the environmental dimension of development, recognizes the environmental dimension for the first time, and says that this need to balance is expressed in the concept of sustainable development. Now, a concept in international law is not necessarily something that is binding. It's not a source of international law in itself. So it's something that you can take into account, but there's no requirement to do so, right? There's a dissenting opinion in the judgment that says, no, it's more than a concept. It has become a general principle of international law, which would make it into a binding idea. And there's a book that was written in a few years later by Christina Voigt, who then makes a strong argument, I think, that now the sustainable development has in fact become a general principle of law, which would mean that whenever an international treaty is made, or whenever a dispute needs to be resolved between states, sustainable development needs to be taken into account. So in other words, that when you're doing, for instance, a treaty that focuses on economic growth, you never say a bilateral investment treaty between two countries, that you always, as a minimum, need to take into account the other two dimensions, the social and the environmental, so that all treaties, all decisions in international law always need to make sure that, as a minimum, no harm is done in the other dimensions of development, right? That even if your focus is on one dimension, the other two dimensions always need to be taken into account. And so no rules should be made or no decisions should be taken that are detrimental to the other dimension. And her argument of saying, of explaining why it's become a general principle of law, is that it's now that the concept of development is now supported by the general opinion of actors in it that engage with international relations. That it's supported by states, it's supported by intergovernmental organizations, it's supported by international civil society. It's even supported by a part of the corporate world, right? If you look at all these CSR standards that refer to sustainable development. So her view is that sustainable development has become a general principle of international law because it's now supported by international public opinion. Next slide. Nevertheless, in the 23rd agenda itself is a soft law document. It's not binding, right? And there you have a lot of room still that is left to the domestic state, right? The goals are, the SDGs are aspirational. It's something we all try to achieve, but there's still a very large role for sovereignty in determining how these SDGs should be translated into domestic policies. So there's still a lot of leeway for national governments, right? And that leeway was necessary, I think, also to be able to agree the SDGs, right? I mean, there's a bargaining process there. Yes, we can have global goals that we all will contribute to, but only at the same time, but only if at the same time we recognize that there's a lot of work and a lot of leeway for the domestic governments. Yeah. So that was the balancing act, I think. You wouldn't have had a consensus on the SDGs if there was not a lot of room left to domestic states. Next slide. This is a lawyer who has tried to make clear how this exercise of balancing, what it could mean, also from a legal perspective. And again, it goes back a bit to what I was saying before. If suppose you're confronted with a specific problem that you need to deal with, the building of a new road, for instance, what would the government need to do? It would first would have to look at all the legal standards, economic, environmental, and social, that are relevant, right? The reason for building the road might be mainly economic, but you would also have to identify all the legal standards, the environmental and social standards that apply, even if they're not your main concern. So for instance, you would have to look at the impact on forests, for instance, if you're building a road in an area where you have forests. You would have to look at the working conditions of the laborers and so on and so on. So you have to chart all the relevant legal standards. And then also, in the second step, decide whether there's any hierarchy between these standards and how important each of them is in terms of the venture that you want to undertake. And then, after almost like attaching a weight to all these different legal standards, then you have to come up with a solution that is optimal in terms of as many of the standards as possible, right? So this balancing act becomes really a very sophisticated exercise in terms of governmental policy making, and it's not easy at all to do this. But it's a suggestion on how this could be done in practice. But as I said, it's a complex exercise and not easy at all. Next slide, please. Okay, the human rights dimension. In the 2030 agenda, again, you know, the human rights are seen as a sort of foundational element of sustainable development. So they are integrated in the concept of sustainable development, and it's clear that in a sustainable development approach, the countries remain bound by any international obligations they've accepted under international human rights law, right? So again, there cannot be a trade-off between the goals, the SDGs, and international human rights commitments or domestic human rights commitments that governments have undertaken. Next slide, please. Yeah, so there is also the debate on the right to development. So the right to development was first proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in 1986 in a soft law document, and it's meant to be a right not of states, but of individuals and peoples. So there's an individual dimension to it, but also a people's dimension. Today, peoples is not just the entire population of the state, it's also peoples within states. So it can be indigenous peoples, for instance, or marginalized communities that may have a different vision of development than the state, right? Next slide. And I think the crucial element of the Declaration on the Right to Development is, in fact, in the third paragraph here. What is it meant to? What is it designed to achieve? On the one hand, the right to development is about participation. The fact that development decisions should be based on the free, meaningful, active, free and meaningful participation of the population. So it means that government decisions need to reflect, need to be the result of a process of participation, but also then that the results of development policies have to be equitably shared among the participation, so that the benefits of of development efforts are fairly shared. Today, the UN Human Rights Council has finally embarked on drafting a legally binding treaty on the right to development. So the negotiations on a treaty on the right to development have just started a few months ago. It's still a very controversial idea, mainly because it's not only about domestic state obligations, but also about international obligations, about shared responsibility between developed and developing countries, and also about the role of intergovernmental organizations, including the IFIs, the International Financial Institutions, and the World Trade. So again, we're back to the enabling international environment. There are certainly in the draft convention that is now being discussed, a lot of that talks about changes to the international system, responsibilities of developed countries also to assist developing countries. And so the idea of a legally binding treaty on the right to development is opposed by the United States and the European Union for the moment, right? So that will be a new test in a way also of the international solidarity idea, even post-COVID. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of progress in terms of, global solidarity ideas yet. So we'll see where that treaty on the right to development ends up. It may take a number of years before the drafting process is concluded. My final slide, I think, please, the next one. So where do we stand? And then I'll finish. I may have talked already a bit too long. Because of course, also in the debate on the right to development, one of the issues that always comes up is how can we have a right to something that when we don't know what development means? If you say there's a right to development, but there's such contestation about the concept of development, should we not then define development finally in order to be able to say we have a right to development? And personally, I don't think it's necessary at all to define development for that purpose. Because if you take what the Declaration on the Right to Development says seriously, and say that development should be defined on the basis of the free, active, and meaningful participation of the population, then it must mean that development is a plural term. Because populations will have different ideas, peoples will have different ideas about what development is, and these ideas will need to be reflected by the government in designing development policies. So that means that there needs to be plurality in the global concept of development. And that plurality is inevitable because the concept of development will have to be informed by the local. And the local is this idea of participatory processes within states on defining development. It will also mean that the global term of development will inevitably, I think, vary over time, as we have seen. Clearly the international community has evolved in how it looks at development and has now, for instance, recognized the environmental dimension of development much more than, say, 15 years ago. So the global term, this is the reason why we now talk about sustainable development. Maybe in 15 years' time, we will have another adjective in front of development, because if local concepts of development change over time, these local concepts feed into the global term of development and they influence that term. So it's logical that the concept of development evolves. But nevertheless, it doesn't make sense to use the global term development unless there is a degree of commonality in the term, right? And so, at least for me, but perhaps also for third world scholars of international law, for that school of thought, what is the common core within the concept of development as it should be protected by international law is that it is about ensuring human dignity, both in the individual dimension, the human dignity of each individual person, as you find it by individual human rights, but also more collectively in terms of the recognizing the importance of local communities, for instance, all over the world to the protection of human dignity. So many people depend on for the protection of their dignity, not so much on the state, because they perceive of the state as a threat to human dignity, but on sort of social security systems that work within the community level. So I think there is a need also to recognize this communitarian dimension in terms of protecting human dignity. Also the idea that of equality, the fact that it's not only about me as a person, that the self is not necessarily at the center. It's important to have individual protection of human dignity, but you also have to be willing to recognize the human dignity of the other as equally important as your own. And so that at the international level also implies the idea of, for instance, a right to development that is equally important for everyone, and that inevitably requires thinking about this enabling international environment and going beyond the domestic state level. So you cannot have in the world that is so interlinked today, you cannot have an equal protection of human dignity of all people or of all communities unless we also rethink the international economic order. And so that solidarity dimension, I think, is also necessarily part of the concept of development as a global norm, right? And so, and it also implies, I think, a necessity for developed countries to move in some of the views that they've had and to move beyond, the national interest, and recognizing that that there is a need also to think much more progressively about the international institutions and their own role in ensuring human dignity also in other countries, and particularly in the global south. Okay, thank you very much. That was a bit long, but I hope still of interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. And Professor Sunil Ray, over to you.
Yeah, I have a few questions to share with him to discuss. I must say that it's a very refreshing one. And at the same time, I could see his struggle to enter into is a bit different domain of intellectualism, of different domain of what is called rationalization process of change and development. So I could see his struggle, but then point is that in several places I could see that is a kind of thing which is being talked about. It's nothing new. But anyway, but I could see his struggle, and something which is at the international level, since he is associated at a different international committees and so on and so forth. So it is a great thing that his concerns are something which is very important to take note of. And these concerns are being expressed by many of us in the developing countries as to how to really proceed for the next centuries or next generation, or even these centuries also. what kind of development pattern could be really evolving for the benefit of the humanity as a whole. That is something is a great concern that he has expressed. I wish such concerns are there everywhere, not only in ethical terms, but also in practice. But that having said that, I have certain questions, rather looking for certain clarifications from Professor Koen. So let me put it before you. It's not very, I have yet to sharpen, but then whatever, because I could hear you and then note down some points. So I thought I should put it forward for you for a discussion or to clarify those points. Now, one thing which I found that, and which has been missing, not only with you, with many eminent sociologists, economists, and political scientists at the international level. It's my concern, I may be wrong, but for debate's sake, not only for debate, even something which is very important for us to know, and this is what in my book also, in my work also have very clearly articulated. Without talking about, nowhere in your presentation, you mentioned about the power relations. You had no critique on power. Nowhere. And that has been the story, especially since I am economist. That has been the story right from the day the economics was born through Adam Smith. He talked everything. I'm talking about development. He talked everything about development. He talked about the deprivation also at the same time. But nowhere mentioned how really the extant power relationships, a power relation at that point of time, did yield or did produce a kind of asymmetry in the society, inequality in the society, unequal society. Nothing, even in your presentation, ethically what you said is absolutely fascinating. But in practice it comes, then you find there's a huge gap between what you're talking, what you desire, and what is there. Just because the only methodological problem here, Professor Koen, I would like to humbly put forward, there's no critique on power relations even at the international level in your presentation. That is the fundamental flaw I could see from myself. Now, you know the countries in the world that are militarily, economically, how rich they are. And at the same time, as you said very rightly, the third world countries, the South. So there is a huge differentiation. And this inequality or unequal world society, something has been going on. It is precisely where, what exactly? Now, I would like to know from you what kind of international law that you could suggest that could really, eliminate this kind of a situation, dichotomy. We talk about democracy. It's a very easy term and very comfortable term for every one of us. I don't know Hitler, whether he talked about democracy or not. I am not a student of history, but there are different types of what is called power relations works in a way. And the way the autocracy or the way what the dictatorial kind of situation regime expresses or manifests is what is called inner strength, prevail upon people, the humanity that goes directly against the democracy. But when it comes, democracy, the very conception, the idea gives a cover to that kind of thing. So under the veil of such democratic cover, immediately all authoritarianism works. Whether you talk about the national level, whether you talk at the international level. And here comes law. Who makes the law? How the laws are being made? That is one set of questions. Then one very interesting thing that we talked about is the self-awareness and self-critical efforts of the intellectuals of the third world, of all global South and global North. Am I right? It's very interesting. What do you mean? I would like to get it clarified. Is it self-critical, critical efforts or self-consciousness increasing, then all that? Is it something, is it developing a critique of the extant theoretical development model? Is it a critique? That means I need to be aware of how the blacks are being tortured by the whites. I need to be aware of the fact that how in India, the social groups like scheduled caste and scheduled tribe who are socially discriminated are being tortured every day, every hour, every woman, girl from the scheduled caste being raped. In other words, what I'm saying that the kind of development that is being done, and you could see the unemployment, the way things have been going on all over the world. Is it necessary for us to be critical, aware of the extent? Because this is nothing but the final outcome or the output of the development pattern that you have been following. Whether it is a half-hearted or not, but even theoretically speaking, this development is something which is yielding this kind of a discrimination, yielding this kind of social torture, yielding this kind of social, annihilation of the people and so on and so forth. So therefore, what I'm trying to argue here, is it necessary we need to develop a different kind of a perspective, the global intellectuals, the global South and global North, intellectuals coming together, develop and go against what is called, and also looking at the transformative mode of production, the different types of transformation taking place at different levels. Is it necessary for us to look outside, that look at there are different kind of changes, development, transformation taking place. It has its own mode of production. We need to reflect on that. Let us go back. Let us not talk about the one which we are talking about for centuries. Is it that you are talking about? Now, there's a very interesting thing that you talked about. Now, my third question is that, third clarification that I'm seeking afterwards. You nicely, convincingly that the planetary boundaries, defining the limits within which humanity can operate. This is what I have been writing also in many places I wrote, and I'm forgetting the name of that ecologist, who first talked about and all that. But anyway, this is within the limit. I totally am with you. And nobody disagrees with you. Nobody will disagree with you. Even some of the tycoons also talked about these planetary boundaries. I mean, like for Ambani, just a few days ago, Indian richest person, he talked about this one, planetary boundaries. He talks about the greenhouse, talked about green and all the green environment and all. Fine, I agree. But Professor Koen, now, do you think that under capital system, I'm putting it very straight, under capital system, under capitalism, is it possible? And I have gone through this, the entire debate, green growth and all kinds of things, and the debate has been going on. But so long as you never develop a critique against the system that is operating, the capital system, the system that always looks for profit, no matter what happens to the people, no matter what happens to humanity, present and future, no matter what happens to the resources. And that is what has been the source of competition. That is what has been breaking the solidarity between human and nature. That is why you people from Ecuador have been raising the questions. That is why there are many Latin American countries that are revising the policies of change. Why does it happen? Why is it not happening in the rest of the world? The question is that within the limits, the boundaries that we talked about, because they are questioning the extant system of production, investment, consumption, and so on and so forth. That is something which is very important for us to know about. Unless you develop a critique of that kind of thing, I think these are the things which are rhetoric, certainly not reality. And is the repeat the same stories going on? And many intellectuals have been talking about. And somebody like me, who'd been exceptionally bad, will be questioning that one, failing just to the one. How is it possible for us to do? It's a kind of conflict, contradiction, understanding. You talk about green, green technology, this and that. But again, there is a huge debate on that. I'm going to part of an international seminar very recently in the next October, in coming October. And that is exactly, we are going to address this question. How long we are going to speak about all these kinds of things when never happens? So therefore, it is necessary for us to, since you are such a great scholar, I am just asking you, without that one, how is it possible for you to really talk about this one, international kind of thing, North-South division? So therefore, now again, the question related to that one. Now this international economic order, and there are plenty of literature on international economic order. When I was a student, PhD scholar, from that onwards, I could see from 1970s, 18, 19, 20, for 20, 30, 40 years or so, we have the international order. So people got exhausted. Now the question is that there is an order. And this order has gone through a little bit of change here and there. Peripheral change, like BRIC was never the big has come, but how important BRIC is in the context of the global capitalism is something nobody knows about it. I'm not too sure. But the question that there is an economic order, international economic order. And this order, if you is fixed without challenging this order, how do you have to have an international law that could favor this kind of ecological system, environmental protection they will give? At the same time, also impoverishment of the global south will go away. You have, I don't want to elaborate this point, but it's very good. The next question is that, so another thing that's debate, this between international law and the domestic law is a very simple thing, but still there are areas of conflicts and convergence. What are the mechanisms based on which you have an international law, for example, talking about, but the domestic law doesn't permit? How do you really resolve this kind of a crisis, which is very important for us to take note of? Now, again, when I was talking about the international order and environmental protection, that is something which is, now, please tell me, why is it that Kyoto Protocol killed? In 2012, there's a fantastic international agreement, very convincing, the sharing over the ecosphere, and then how really each and every country will be using, and therefore there will be equilibrium in the international level. But why is it killed? You had an experience of that kind of international law, which benefiting the developing countries as well. But why was it killed? And I think you should be knowing this answer. So that is something which must be taken into consideration, that if you have an international law of this kind, and you find then how the international order, the most powerful people of the world, powerful countries of the world, will see that such kind of a law never exists which will harm their interest. That it amounts to say that one. Now, in the light of that, against this background, how do you proceed with your arguments is a very important thing that I would like to know, or rather enlightened by you. Now, the question is the sustainable development. You have really banked upon sustainable development. And that's a very used question. That is very easily talked about. Everywhere, right from any politician of a local level to the biggest economics talking about it, look, leave aside UNDP, leave aside all international organizations, with which I had a very fierce argument some time ago. Now, sir, this internal sustainable development that you talked about, I have no, ethically speaking, logically speaking, no disagreement with you. But the problem is this again, the coming there, sustainable development, that it's very good. And that the one big question that you have said, that legalizing the sustainable development need to be legalized. Once it is legalized but do you think that the difference between in legalized, will it be really happening in that way? How is it possible, again, the same system that you have, when the extant system, extant capital system that you have, and this sustainable development, because what operationally, what is important that we need to find out this one. Now, last point, perhaps, this, what ethically is basically, there are 4 dimensions that we talked about. One is ethics, another is constitutional, another is administration, and the national goal. There are the 4 things that we talked about and dwelt upon, which is very important. But primarily, your presentation is based upon ethics, ethical values. And finally, it is something like preaching ethics. You need to defend yourselves against my statement. It's a preaching ethics. It should be done, it should be done without changing something else. Now, sir, Professor Koen, I would like to know more from you. It's a kind of the enlightening. I'm asking this question, I want to enlighten by you. Saying that, well, if you have a system, given this system, it is possible for us to follow this ethics, the rules. That is something which is very important. Now, I do not disagree with you. The solidarity issue, shared humanity, empathy, and solidarity. In my book that I have explained, this solidarity economics has to fructify based on one principle: solidarity of the people, solidarity of the deprived of the country, deprived of the world. You need to put solidarity against the system which is depriving them. I put it very clearly, theorizing cohesive development in my book, that this is something which is very important. We need to have a solidarity. But if you make a general statement like solidarity, like empathy, it makes no difference. The person who have been torturing also talk about what is called solidarity. But the question is that solidarity of the people who are deprived all over the world. Solidarity of the people of the deprived who are deprivation, not only economically, socially, environmentally, gender, racially, all types of deprived people together. And that is why I talked about cohesion or cohesive. And that is all put together and then gives a new dimension, new change, and new development. And they do have to have a correspondence or what is called solidarity with the nature. What Ecuador has shown, what Mexico has shown, what some of the Latin America has been showing. We need to really show all over the world in the same way. We need to learn lessons from them. So in spirit that we talked about, the solidarity with the North and South, it is the deprived of the South, the deprived of the North, as you said very rightly, the Northern people, there are huge deprivation. So Northern deprived of the South and deprived of the North together to fight against the exchange system, to go against the exchange system, have a different development perspective, which is really going to stand parallel to the one that we are talking about. In spirit, in argumentation, in logical reasoning, I fully agree with you, but these are some clarification I thought is an opportunity for me to put before you, to only to be enlightened by you. Thank you so much. I will not bore you more.
Thank you so much, Professor Ray, for being so I would say so direct and honest and truthful in raising so many of questions. Professor Koen, I also have some question, and we are also joined by Mr. Reni Jacob, who is joining us from Tamil Nadu, down south in India, and he's the coordinator of International Justice Mission, which also looks into human rights issues in our subcontinent. So would you like to respond to Professor Sunil Ray now, or maybe have to also some more questions and more queries? Professor Koen?
Sorry. Yes. Thank you for all these remarks. I was looking a bit. I was conscious a bit about the time because, but I'll try to respond to some of these very pertinent remarks. On power relations, yes. I mean, I fully accept the criticism. International law is made by states, and states are unequal, right? In treaty law, a state has the choice whether or not to ratify a treaty. Take this Convention on the Right to Development that I was talking about. If the Global South pushes a treaty that reflects all the concerns of the Global South, there is no guarantee that any country from the Global North will become a party to the treaty. So that's power relations in a way, because you cannot force any state to become a party to a treaty. So they have a choice. If you're the Global South, you have a choice. Either you do a Global South treaty that will only be ratified by countries from the Global South, or you start making compromises in order to get the countries from the Global North on board and to have a chance that at least some of them will ratify the treaty, right? So obviously, if international law is made by states, then obviously the power relations between those states will be reflected in international law. That's totally true. This is one reason why scholars from the South often argue that more weight should be given to resolutions of the General Assembly, which are not binding in principle. Because in the United Nations General Assembly, every state has one vote, right? And so it's a different way of making decisions. Because if every state has one vote, so there you have formal equality. It doesn't matter whether you're a powerful state or not, you only have one vote. Liechtenstein has one vote, the United States has one vote. And the Global South has the majority in the General Assembly. So there is an argument now to say, well, if the United Nations General Assembly adopts resolutions by an overwhelming majority or by consensus, then those in fact should reflect the view of the international community in a much more democratic way than treaties, for instance. So there are attempts now to have, a more inclusive systems of lawmaking also at the international level, I think. But there are clear constraints that remain. That's absolutely true. Let me on the self-critical. Again, my concern there was mostly by scholars need to be self-critical. I think it's again the question of this global dialogue that in a way we are now engaging in. It's in terms of positioning yourself as a scholar, I think. Where are you in this global debate on trying to assist the deprived communities all over the world, right? In achieving human dignity. I think, so for instance, where am I? Where am I as a scholar in a debate in a North-South debate on these issues? Where do I come from? What is my background in this? And what is the legitimacy of what I'm saying? And how should I interact with you? Being a scholar in your position. What does it mean? And what does it mean also when we try and do books together, for instance, or when we try and engage as an international intellectual community to, in a sense, be aware also of the position. That we are as scholars also determined by a history of scholarship and of a structure of scholarship in a world that is organized the way it is organized today. For instance, if I write a book now on development and human rights, where should I publish? Should I continue publishing with, or should I try to publish in the Global South with publishers there to also challenge in a way the power relations that exist in the publishing world, right? Should I be publishing no longer with Cambridge and Oxford, but in South Africa or in India? Because you reach another audience. Should we go, open access publishing, for instance? Should we go away from, because if you talk about capitalism is very much a part of the publishing world as well, right? There are power relations in the publishing world. Should we not be reflecting much more about those? If I want to publish in open access with a commercial publisher, I have to pay the publisher, right? For not being able to sell the book at the price that he wants to charge. So I, as a researcher, now have to fund a commercial firm to publish my work in open access so that it could actually reach a much broader audience. There are elements of inequality also in the publishing world. And so this is what I was talking about mostly when I was talking about self-criticism in terms of how we talk to each other, but also in how we deal with producing research and how it's published. So I would hope that in the intellectual debate, we can do better than the states, right? And if we talk north-south as scholars, that we can get away from some of the entrenched positions that states have in the debate on. And for instance, when I was involved in the drafting exercise on this Convention on the Right to Development, I felt that, and this was with scholars from the different regions of the world, I felt we could find middle ground positions and consensus positions that apparently states are unable to find. So there is a responsibility, I think, for independent scholars to show also that these north-south divisions can be overcome in the intellectual debate, and that there are ways to finding a global consensus. Because if we cannot do it, how can we expect states to do it? I mean, so that is the self-criticism that I was talking about. I think the SDGs are impossible to achieve all at the same time. I think there is a problem with planetary boundaries and the 2030 agenda. I mean, I think if you look at the SDGs on economic growth, I don't think those can be achieved at the same time as the SDGs on the environment. No. So I think, although there's this language of balancing, I think there is a real problem with the 2030 agenda, that it's still very much biased in favor, in fact, of a traditional model of economic growth based on capital accumulation, and that although we're supposed to balance although we're all of the SDGs are supposed to have equal weight, in practice there is an unresolvable tension because the planetary boundaries rationale hasn't really been translated fully into the 2030 agenda. So I agree with you that if we maintain a model of economic growth, which the 2030 agenda still subscribes to, we're going to run into difficulties in terms of protecting the planetary boundaries. So that fundamental tension hasn't been resolved in the concept of sustainable development. But again, it's because it's a compromise. The 2030 agenda is a consensus document that needs to be acceptable to all states in the world. And so it's full of compromises. It doesn't give you, for instance, it doesn't give the states very clear indications on how they are supposed to do this balancing. And it doesn't give them these indications. I think it's conscious. It's consciously doesn't give them the tools to do it and just leaves it to the domestic level to solve all these problems. And so I fully agree with you in that respect. And yes, and I'll just say something about your final comment. I also agree with you on these coalitions of the deprived. And of course there is, I don't know to what extent international law is able to foster that coalition of the deprived, because it's, as I said, international law is a product of states, and states are not about the deprived, right?
Yeah.
So you can have elements of the protection of the deprived within the system of international law, because at some you have breakthroughs in international law from time to time, and human rights is a breakthrough. In a system was a breakthrough, and I think they're there, so you can use them, and you can use elements in that system that are also beneficial to the deprived. But also, I think if you want this coalition of the deprived in the north and the south, you have to go outside of international law, right? And outside of that system, and work with mechanisms of international civil society, with alternatives international law, because there are also scholars that, for instance, do sort of the tradition of the Russell tribunals. I don't know whether you're familiar with those, where you go outside of international law and produce an alternative international law that reflects the concerns of the deprived. That is not really law, but where you say, well, if that would be the main concern, let's do a treaty among civil society organizations that in fact reflects that fully and has to be mediated by the states as an alternative legal order. And I think that's useful just to show what should be done, even if that's not law, and it's more like it's more in terms of campaigning, but it's drafted in legal language to show that an alternative legal order would be possible if international law didn't reflect power relations in the way that it, by necessity, in the way that does through the processes of international law creation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very nice comment. I would quickly ask for one or two questions. Professor Ray also asked about solidarity, and Professor Koen also highlighted that how this campaign and this thing can, that really leads the alternative legal architecture also sir is suggesting. On that, just to follow up, I just really wanted to highlight that if we have that kind of mechanisms, then state and also the citizens also question that what is the legitimacy of such organization and the leadership, because time and again this thing is coming up, but that is becoming, you know, a proper question, or many a times it becomes a political lobby of some sort. So we also know that how legitimacy. I have really few very basic questions to ask to Professor Koen. One was, sir, what is development? You really touched upon development as freedom. As an economist and as an economic student, we really learned all these things, development as freedom. Now we have sustainable development goals with the tagline, leave no one behind. And you discussed all the matters also. And having seen this pandemic and all the countries going autonomous or becoming more closed because of their self-interest, and this coronavirus pandemic is really highlighting that. How do you see the legal intellectuals are looking at development per se now? Earlier, we really know that by development, we mean expansion of human choices. And when we are talking about this right discourses, not only state, but others also make this question of then from where the wealth will come. You're talking about only redistribution and giving rights and doles, but how will it be sustainable? So that question is coming time and again. So would you like also to reflect upon on this very essential question of what is development? How do you see it then from the legal point of view, and what are the major changes in the definition itself going ahead?
Okay, I tried to tackle this question of what is development at the end in the final slide by resisting to answer the question in a way, and by resisting the temptation to define development at the global level, and by arguing that that as the right to development suggests, the definition of development should come from a process of free, active, and meaningful participation within a society, right? So it should be, for instance, inspired by the concept of sustainable development now because that's sort of the mainstream concept in UN. You could say, well, for the UN, probably development today means sustainable development with these three dimensions. But if we accept that individuals and communities within societies have a right of active, free, and meaningful participation in defining development, then that means that inevitably the concept of development is going to be plural. Because each society or even each communities will have different visions of development, and then it's for the state to come up with policies that reflect these choices. So there's not going to be one definition of development. What the right to development says is that there has to be plurality in the concept of development. That at the global level, we can say something like, there's a concept of sustainable development, or we can say, as I would suggest, it's fundamentally about ensuring human dignity. And so indeed, their notions of values come in, but that the concept of development at the global level should be, by definition, fairly abstract in a way, because then you need these participatory processes within societies to give it real content, I think. So that would be my and it's a bit frustrating because you would like, but I think it would actually be counterproductive to have a global definition of development, because it would constrain these participatory processes. And if you accept indeed that international law is a result of power relations, then it would be wrong to leave it to international law to define development. Because it would actually be bad in many instances for people that are deprived within society. So let's not do that. But let's, on the contrary, say that you have to have processes of decision-making of development that are as inclusive as possible.
Great.
On civil society, of course, you always have the problem of the legitimacy of civil society. I think the answer to that is probably, again, that civil society organizations need to show their legitimacy by demonstrating that they reflect the concerns of the deprived. So that the test there is really one of the legitimacy test is that they need to demonstrate that their agendas are defined by the people that they are claiming to work for. And you can do that through representative structures within NGOs. But you can also, I think, it's, in the research that I was talking about in the very beginning, we tried to talk to slum dwellers themselves, right? To do social science research among those groups, to try and find out what their agendas were, and then also look critically at the NGOs that were working in the slums to see, to what extent what they were saying actually connected to what the people that we were interviewing were saying. And of course, I wasn't interviewing. I cannot do interviews in the slum, but we worked with local researchers, right? And it's when we were talking about researchers and being self-critical. If as a European I go and do research in slums in New Delhi, obviously all sorts of difficulties arise in terms of my own position, right? And how you set up that research in a way that you actually get reliable results, right? And of course, you can only do that through local researchers and not as an external. So again, North-South relations also come up in doing this kind of research. And I mean, there's far too few Indian researchers that do research on the North, on for instance, trafficking in the North and all of that. Anyway, but I'm getting off track now. Thank you.
Right. Sunil sir, yes, over to you. But we also have Rennie sir, who coordinates International Justice Mission and joining us from Kerala. He would also like to add some practitioners' point of view, especially looking at the pandemic and others, so that we all can gain. Sunil sir, would you like to go first?
Okay, would it be okay to end the session in about 10 minutes time, because I have another meeting that I need to attend.
Dr. Arjun,
Please. Sunil sir, yes.
Dr. Arjun, shall I?
Go ahead, Sunil sir.
Okay. Just in relation to your question, Professor Koen, he goes back, Dr. Arjun goes back to the fundamentals. Again, the definition of development and all that he talks about, which is really important. And, as we have gone through many literature and we are all going through the literature on development, every one of us, and there is a huge scope for being confused at what. Here I could see your response, 70% to 80% you devoted on the processes how to achieve the what is called development, which is completely right. I completely agree with you on that. But now I would like to put it before you for consideration. I'm not sure. Well, had I been in your place, perhaps I would have been similar way react. But then over time, I felt that it could be crystallized. The answer could be simple. One sentence, let me put it this way, just for your consideration. Leading freedom to lead dignified life without destroying ecological resilience. This is what I have defined. I have been trying to define and put it in one language, one sentence. The freedom to repeat, freedom to lead a dignified life for all human species in the earth, in the planet Earth. Freedom to lead dignified life of all human species in the earth without destroying ecological resilience. If I put it this way, how do you like this?
No, I think it's fine. Yes, I think it's I think it's excellent. Yeah? I think we're actually quite close to each other in how we perceive it. What I think is important, is this international dimension. So I think in the concept of development, at least at the international level, there is this sharing of responsibility idea also. That it's not just,
but that is a process.
It talks about the level above that.
That's a process. That's a process. Sharing the responsibility is a process.
True, it's true. It's
a process.
Okay, so that's the other 70%. Okay, fine. Okay, good. No, I think in terms of basic concept, yes. Yeah, I think we're very close to each other.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Rennie Jacob, sir, over to you. Kindly be brief. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Arjun. I'm very much happy to have listened to Professor Koen and Professor Sunil. I just want to make one or two brief comments. One is the Sustainable Development Goals will remain as aspirational goals if it is not translated into realities for the most vulnerable, that is the left behind people. So corresponding legislations, policies, and schemes need to be developed by every state so that it will become a reality. And also it is important that we listen to the people, the voiceless. We amplify the voice of the people so that they are listened by the state. Another aspect I, as a practitioner, always believe is that to end poverty, we should end violence. The violence against women and children, violence against the vulnerable communities are on the increase, especially in a COVID context. The online trafficking, child sexual abuse material, that is on the increase. So what is happening if we do not address the issues of violence? How can we address the issue of development? So that is one aspect I want to bring to your attention in this discussion, that fully functional public justice system should work. Then only justice will be there for the poor. And in that context, I believe that SDG 16 is very important. Justice and peace, strong institutions, no corruption, rule of law, good governance. If that is not happening, development will not happen. So I believe that SDG 16 is hub of all the SDGs, and states should focus on that to bring good governance, strong institutions, and rule of law. Then only violence against women and children will end, and then only real development will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Excellent point. Professor Ken, would you like to add anything over that?
Not really, unless to express agreement, right, with the position, and yes, and sometimes we in these debates about development we forget the essentials, and one of the essentials is indeed that states should not use violence indiscriminately against people they don't like, and so I fully agree. Thank you.
Great, and it has been a very long session. Just in a minute, Professor Ray, would you like to conclude? Then I will give a vote of thanks.
Okay.
For this very important deliberation.
Yeah, that's Professor Koen, I must really thank you for a very stimulating presentation, especially one thing which you certainly, I must say that at the international level, even at the national level also, everywhere, conception of development, when you conceive a development, this has been a kind of a story everywhere, even in India also today. Many economics, sociologists, or social scientists for that matter, confuse development with the growth rate of economy. Talk about growth rate, how much growth rate is there? Even in the pandemic, when people have been dying due to the lack of what is called oxygen, our Niti Aayog people went on speaking how much the growth rate will be there. 9%, 7%, 8%, 6%, and so on and so forth. And then World Bank goes on giving another sense of estimation. This is something which is diverting the attention of the people again and again from the reality to the growth rate. It's a panacea. And bringing people together to look for growth rate, higher growth rate, the mechanism which market economics have set in. Look, if you have a growth rate, economy will develop, everybody will be benefiting, and there will be development. That is how the whole linkage, I'm not going to explain further, but you know better, the whole thing has been going on. Not only at the national level, but also those who are in the grip of market economy, not only at the national level, but at the international level. This has been championed, this cause, this path, by the World Bank, all international organizations. Now, there are countries like Bhutan, there are other countries who are trying to strive of a different kind of a code. They said, look, it is a happiness index, not growth. Happiness means you have got all kinds of indicators for human happiness. And that is something which measures your change, transformation, or development. Very few countries. But again and again, Bhutan is a small country which has got more positive growth rate in this pandemic than India's negative growth rate, minus 8%. Can you imagine? But they talk about human happiness as an index of change and development and so on and so forth. But here we do talk about the same stories. But here your presentation has certainly made a very important mark here. Look, you are turning our attention to saying that if you really want to talk about development, talk about social injustice as well, talk about environmental protection as well, you talk about what is called discrimination against people as well, you talk about employment, you never mention about employment, of course, as I could be, but certainly is the right to employment. Yeah. So anyway, even if you miss something, that's something that should be a part of the whole discourse, right to employment, and finally, right to survive with dignity, that is human rights. What could be the human rights than right to live with dignity? This is the basic fundamental human right. Where is you find the deprivation of these people from these human rights? It is the system must question. People should question the system. Why some people get the full human right, but the majority of people are deprived of these human rights? Not only talk about sanitation, water, there are hundreds of other aspects which need to be highlighted where the deprivation has been continuing as a systemic operation. how is it possible to subvert this kind of a situation? So you have taken our attention to that one. Say that if you really want to conceive development, you need to really weave in these elements, social, political, environmental elements together to see how the development could flourish. I really thank you so much. And at the same time, this debate should be there, not only at the national level, at the international level, not only at the international, percolate down to the national level, everywhere. So certainly a shift in concepts of development, international law, it should be embedded with the law. With the law of the universe, the law of the humanity, law is, I won't call a law of the society, law of the, it's a law for human survival, law of the human race, law of the humanity. That is something which is extraordinarily important. When you talk about the humanity or the human race to the planet, it is international law. And that should be applicable everywhere. And that is why we achieve the real development. Otherwise, we'll continue to talk about the same thing. The reality, difference between reality and the rhetoric will continue and expand over a period of time. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your very exciting talk and deliver, which is very enlightening for every one of us. Thank you so much, Professor Koen.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me quickly propose a vote of thanks. So for this very enriching and excellent deliberation, we are almost double the time, but so thankful for Professor Koen to stay. And on behalf of IMPRI, Center for Human Dignity and Development, CHDD, IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, Counterview, and Center for Development, Communication and Studies, CDECS, Jaipur, we thank all of you for joining this IMPRI hashtag Web Policy Talk, and in the special series, the State of Development Discourses, hashtag Cohesive Development with Professor Sunil Ray. And we are very thankful for Professor Koen De Feyter for giving this excellent lecture today on shifting conception of development in international law, and such a stimulating discussion, Professor Sunil Ray. Really today, I liked it very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
yeah, Professor.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to be with you this morning, and I'll be happy to continue the conversation if you would be, if there would be an interest in doing so. So thank you very much for organizing this, and I enjoyed it very much as well. Thank you.
Professor Koen, shall
yes.
I say, I've got a paper with me who I have shared with Dr. Arjun. That's a alternative development paradigm.
Okay.
Yeah. So may I request Dr. Arjun to share with him?
I will share an email.
Okay. Thank you very much.
That's really good.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, plus only one request to you, after you go through, give me some feedback so that I can further improve it upon. It's an alternative paradigm, development paradigm that I've worked on. So once you go through, give your feedback. Dr. Arjun will give the email to you. So I'll improve it upon. A person like your scholarship is something that will be helpful for me to improve upon my understanding idea. But really,
I will do my utmost best. And be happy to do that. Okay.
When you visit, do let us know. I will try to have you and Sunil sir meet somehow.
Excellent. Okay. Goodbye.
Have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.